the Lighthouse Bookshop. Thank you for coming out to this event to celebrate the book Practical Anarchism. We're really excited to have the author Scott Franson with us. They've told me that this is the start of their tour for the book, so let's give them like a really warm welcome. And they will introduce themselves and introduce the book and lead you through the event. So yeah, thank you for coming, and thank you for coming, Scott.
Thank you so much for having me and welcoming me. I've never been to Edinburgh or Scotland before, so this is exciting for me to visit. And yeah, so I'm embarking on a UK tour over the next week or so. And that's really also kind of thrilling to use the book as an opportunity to come and meet people and talk to people. So, I mean, really for me, it's very interesting to get to have conversations. So I'd like to at least, leave room for questions after I talk for a little bit, but also feel free if you have things come up while I'm talking and you want to ask me a question, feel free to interrupt me and, or, raise your hand or say something. Because the whole point for me about writing a book is to engage with people. I have written this book, Practical Anarchism, A Guide for Daily Life. One thing I just wanted to, I guess, thinking about how I want to structure the talk, is anarchism something that people are like super familiar with or not super familiar with? Because I could start sort of at the beginning or get right into it, depending. Anyone feel like they want to share? Or just like, who here is like, I'm an anarchist already? So some people, okay. So maybe I'll talk a little bit about like what my like take on anarchism is in this book, which again, like, I never thought that I was going to write a book on anarchism. That wasn't a goal of mine. And there's like something that feels contradictory to the idea of being like, I'm going to be an authority on anarchism, right? Because anarchism is supposed to be anti-authoritarian. But in the way that this book itself came about was kind of by happenstance. An editor that was working with Pluto was looking for a specific kind of book on anarchism that wasn't geared specifically to like what you read about mostly in the news, which is like, the people who are breaking Starbucks windows during protests, the Black Bloc, or like we have the kind of like over a century old now image of like the mustachioed anarchist throwing a bomb or whatever, right? Anarchism is seen often within the mainstream and like liberal perspective as violence. And so the idea was like to look at anarchism as something that like actually occurs within your daily life. And I was like, I saw this like call for someone to write this book, and I was like, oh, that actually would like help me consolidate things that I've been thinking and doing over the last number of years. So I wrote a proposal and then I wrote this book. So yeah, it wasn't like my aim, but my idea, like, I don't know, I'll kind of, what I want to do, I guess, I thought about reading a little bit from it, but I think I'll probably skip doing that and let you read it if you're interested and talk a little bit about some of my ideas that I get about in the book, get to in the book. And then some of the ways that I'm framing it actually after having written the book when I'm talking to people, which because it's also interesting to me to like just try out new ideas. Like I said, anarchism, often we have this association with riots, people dressed in black. Direct action is a word that's like often associated with anarchism, which is the idea that you don't ask someone to give you the thing that you want, but do it yourself, right? And that could mean a lot of different things. It could mean like we don't like Starbucks windows, so we're gonna break them. Or it could mean like, the people in our community need this and we're not gonna like petition politicians for it, we'll like provide it for ourselves. For me, there's something that's interesting in anarchism that like gets overlooked if you kind of overemphasize what to me also is the kind of masculinist image of like someone who's right, like in the street there to riot. And actually, a lot of people who have had sort of experience on the streets might tell you that like the good protests, the things that like feel like something gets done, often have a lot of like preparatory work that's done by anarchists, right? Like anarchists are really good at organizing and creating the situation for a compelling street movement to happen. So starting with this idea, like if you have had experience in the streets during the protest, something happens when you're there in the streets with like maybe comrades that you know, but also often just like when you're facing off with the police, the violent police, like certain kinds of bonds might form between people, right? Things that a kind of like connection with people that you don't live in your daily life, the life that we live where we're isolated by the forms of the state and the market, so that we don't feel like we can rely on each other, that we like have to have authorities intervene if we need anything, or like that you just like every problem that you have is your own individual responsibility to solve and figure out, right? There's something about these kinds of acute moments that happen in street protests that like bring people together. Like you will form relationships that feel stronger than some like within like an hour than someone you might have known for years, based on like that kind of confrontational situation. And so one thing that I was interested in is like how do we relate that sort of experience to the rest of our life? Because there's something exciting about that that's compelling, that gets people to continue to do movements. It's like also a feeling that I think people describe as like, this is what life should be, this is what life should feel like, the kind of connection that or like another way of putting it is like that is the glimpse of the better world that we're fighting for, and that way that you connect with people. And I have one question for myself, for us, like, are those moments necessarily spontaneous and fleeting, right? Like, can we continue those moments of connection, that like glimpse of the new world? Is that something that we could have like extensive in time, right, and live that way? Or is there something that's important about that moment of connection, like being kind of something that comes together and dissolves, at a certain point? And one of the major ideas that I work at in this book is, well, I'll get into it a little bit later, what I call like the breakup theory of anarchism, but we are given this idea, we're kind of sort of cultured to think that like the important things last forever, right? The state is eternal, capitalism is eternal. There's like meanings and structures to life, that this is the way it is, this is the way it has to be. And I want to use anarchism to think differently about our sense of time and time spans in particular, right? To say that like good things aren't only the things that last. And actually what anarchism can teach us is how to dissolve things, right? How to give things up when they're not working anymore, or to think of projects as things that don't need to continue, right, once they serve their purpose. Some of this thinking I get from a kind of typical anarchist organizing method called the affinity group. Maybe some of you know this. I think the term dates back to the end of the 19th century in Italy, but it's also something that was used a lot by the Spanish anarchists. But like an affinity group is a form of organization where people get together based on something shared, an affinity, right? Like it could be that you all have similar like ideas of like how things should be done. It could be that you have a shared project, right? A goal in mind. And you organize from that basis, right? It's different than like a party structure, right? A lot of like kind of Marxist type leftist organizations have parties with authorities and like a platform and like ways that you are supposed to do things. I mean, there's also anarchists that do things like that way too. But the affinity group has a little bit more flexibility and fluidity. So I'm using this model as a way of thinking about how we could also like relate to our lives that way, that like, we come together with people in specific moments through shared affinities. Those affinities have a timeline of their own, and we let them go right when they're done. How this works also in organizing, and I think this is super important and something that people don't always enact, is that say you're in a group, right? Like another sort of element of anarchist organizing is consensus-based organizing, which rather than like in a vote, a democracy where like the majority of people, whoever you have like something to decide, and you take a show of hands, the majority takes the makes the decision. In a consensus-based organizing, you have to sort of get everyone on board, right, through consensus and talk it through, which can take a lot of time. And you could also just like never make a decision that way. This was the kind of experience in the States, at least, with Occupy Wall Street, where they'd have these big assemblies that anyone could come into, organize their own consensus. So people would even just like show up just to like block things, right? Because like they didn't even have anything, they had no skin in the game, right? But the real way for me that consensus-based organizing should work is that along the kind of affinity method is that if you're in a group and you find yourself wanting to block everything the group is doing, and like kind of everyone else is sort of like on the same page, then you're not in the right group, right? Like you don't need to be in that group. Form another group with the people who want to do the things your way, right? I've had this personal experience where like I've been organizing with people and like there's just one person who blocks everything. It becomes a form of like kind of a sort of micro form of power. And they'll often use like, principles for why things must be blocked. But yeah, that is a sort of experience where you should kind of learn your way out of that group. It's not the place for you, which is fine. It's fine not to belong into a group. It's fine to make your own group. Where another kind of idea that comes from sort of anarchist organizing is being open to a diversity of tactics, which is that there's different ways to do things, and like we don't need to police each other's ways of approaching that. So for me, that translates into something else I'm very interested in anarchism is giving up with ideas of purity. Right? A lot of the times you'll find leftists and revolutionaries getting very stuck with ideas of how things have to be so stubbornly that like they can't actually face the realities of the world in front of them, especially when they're beholden to like old histories of what revolution had maybe looked like or what they think it looked like, right? So there's like certainty about how things have to be. For me, anarchism brings to us a kind of like ability to give up on ideas of purity. They haven't worked, right? We don't want a revolution that's like pious and correct. And we can use anarchism as a kind of experimental method where we like try things and fail, right? Like maybe, and this is something, if you call yourself an anarchist, you'll find people who want to argue with you, say like, prove to me that anarchism works, that there is an anarchist state or whatever, which is an oxymoron. Show me where anarchism is, right? But I think there's something important in the fact that, well, first of all, it's a trick question, as David Graeber has said. This is sort of a trick question because there's no such thing as an anarchist state. Like people are looking in the wrong place for what they're asking for. But also, I think there's something important, maybe even theoretically, in the fact that like it's hard to point that out because anarchism asks us to keep rethinking how we're doing things with the aim in not allowing power to consolidate or to concentrate in specific places, right? To cohere in one place. The sci-fi author Ursula Le Guin, who's someone I learned a lot from in her anarchist utopian novel, The Dispossessed, talks about how anarchism needs a constant vigilance because like authority can tend to coagulate in that way, right? And so we need to do work not to have that happen. So anarchism has a kind of discontinuity, right? It might not always be visible. It might not always be long-lasting. And so, yeah, so to me, that has something to do with like giving up on purity and also like allowing ourselves to be wrong, to fail, to experiment, right? So many people don't do sort of revolutionary things in their lives because they're not sure what that it will lead to the right thing. But like it might be better to try and fail something and then know from that experience than to sit and like just stay stuck in whatever situation you're in right now, right? Yeah, kind of allowing ourselves possibilities of like play and failure and like this to me also ties to the kind of individualistic sort of antidote to the individualistic ethos that we're given in liberal democracy, is that like everything's sort of like on our shoulders, and so failure becomes like a kind of moral shortcoming. And maybe some of you have like experienced this, like if you don't have enough money for something, like then you feel like there's something ethically wrong with you, right? But like we can actually inhabit our failures. So just like, there's like a lot of queer theory that talks about this stuff too, that we can inhabit our failures sort of without that shame, without that morality. So my theory of anarchism, one of the ways that I'm approaching anarchism here is that it's like in between places, that it comes up in between things, and that actually it's something that you may already like do in your life already without calling it that. And to me, I'm like very much less interested in naming things anarchism or asking people to call themselves anarchism than to sort of open them to thinking about these things in a certain kind of way, and you call it whatever you want, right? Like the name itself doesn't matter. This is again like a difference for me between anarchism and other leftist ideologies that like get proper names attached to them, like Marx or Lenin or whatever, which is a kind of piety, right? Which is like this person at this time, this specific historical time, knew how to do things. Anarchism doesn't get that same kind of labeling because it doesn't get attached to one person. What was I saying? That it allows us this kind of like way to like sort of rethink that the things that we're already doing in our life, finding the spaces in our relationships with each other, or relationships to the structures that we inhabit, whether that's like work or school or other kinds of roles that we're expected to play. Like for me, this also extends to things like gender and race, and think about where we can kind of amplify, multiply spaces of liberation, collective liberation, autonomy or self-determination for different people, and not impose authority like through our own interactions with people. One of the metaphors that I use in the book to talk about this is like a kaleidoscope shift for me, thinking like an anarchist I don't really love this word anarchistically, but in an anarchist way, it's like a sort of kaleidoscope shift. So you like alter your perception of things and start seeing, right, that the top-down perspective that we're given, right, which is like that there's authority from on high that knows how things should be done, or that we need to defer to authorities. But it could be like religious, right, that there's like a creator who is all powerful above us. We kind of shift it and can like sort of see in between the cracks and see things anew. And the world will fall into place differently. So there's a couple things about that, right? This like kaleidoscope shifting that I'm talking about. Like for me, there's an ethical aspect to anarchism that's important, and that what sets it out apart from other kinds of like leftist, let's say, approaches to things. To me, it involves a categorical rejection of certain things that are often taken for granted, right? Like that we need. We're stuck a lot right now because we are reliant on things that we receive from the state and the market to survive, which is just a fact, right? Like that's okay to acknowledge and say that this is. what we're doing, but like a lot of people then base their organizing on needing to perpetuate that relationship of reliance on the state and the market, right? Like to not think beyond like whatever social welfare is, that is under attack anyway, and like minimizing it constantly. There's the idea for me in anarchism, when we're talking about what we want to do, right? We have to categorically reject certain things like the state, that we don't want to replicate the state, because the state is a concentration of power that relies on things like the police and coercion in order to do things as a certain kind of organizing. And it's very hard to get to that place. Because of how our lives are circumscribed. And similarly, like I think about things like, I don't know, the words like society and civilization, which are things that are seen as good in themselves, right? But have this legacy of colonialism and racism about who gets to be defined as like civilized, or what values are imposed on the world, right? Or like the distinction between human and other animals, to say that some are better than, like that humans are better than others, right? We have to like sort of reject these. It's like in every kind of binary situation, reject the term that's on top, right? The one that's prioritized, that's privileged, and say that that perspective is actually what we are willing to give up. And for me, anarchism involves a letting go of even the things right now that we maybe cherish, right? That we hold on to. Because though the world that we would like to see and that we would like to create can't have all of these remnants, right? Because it would recreate some of these power systems if we held on to them. So like for me, this has to do also with like gender, right? If we like are really holding on to womanhood as something, right, as a certain kind of feminism that is invested in a certain understanding of femininity or womanhood that's defined by patriarchal masculinity, right? Post-revolution, we'll recreate a gender system, right? Even if it's like flipped, maybe with women on top, it would still be a hierarchy. So we have to like give up some of these categories. I would extend the same thing to like a lot of the kind of identity markers that we have, like also with race, because race is created through colonialism and capitalism. So as my book is like this kind of everyday practical approach to anarchism, the thing that I say that we need to do to try to kind of think about these things and implement it in our lives is a process of disidentification. We identify with the power structures even when we are at the bottom of the hierarchy, right? Like, it happens through reading novels or watching movies, where we like have that kind of hero as our model. We consume so much media that's like people living in totally inaccessible ways to us, right? And we identify with that, right? Like no matter how little resources we have, we are always like about to maybe be in a better position. We have to disidentify with all of these power structures. So like part of the kind of, it's like a negative form, I guess, of anarchism that I'm talking about is like rooting out all these state logics that are in our head. I go through in the book in different sections through things like your relationships, like parenting, like the idea of work, thinking about like work and its like moral value, but also like work as a space that instills competition over resources, thinking about how you can steal your time away from the things that steal it from you. Work, even things like luxury and art and other sort of organizing of our lives. So disidentification is one of the methods that I'm talking about. Because if we say there was some kind of like revolution that tore down the government in one place, right? And we hadn't done work to think about how we in our daily lives reproduce these power systems, we would just reproduce that again somehow, right? Which is like historically been what has happened with revolutions that operate through the state, right? They think that they're going to impose a revolutionary state, and what they do is end up reproducing a state which operates through violence. And whether it's like a communist state or a capitalist state, it's doing the same kind of thing ultimately, right? Whether there's like some things are better in some places and some things are better in other places. So like in this sort of rooting out of state logics, there's like this naturalizing of hierarchy as a biological fact, which is something that we have to kind of like really look at. Like our whole Western world is organized through the idea that like we can classify the world through our sight and know where everyone belongs just by looking at them, right? It's plain as what you see. This is why race and gender are such effective tools of oppression, because they're visual, right? And they're supposedly immediately possible. It's not actually true. And then, right, it's not just like it gets presented to us as objective facts that you passively can just see people and know where they are, but it's a hierarchy that's imposed constantly over and over and over again, right? And we live this, we do this even beyond. We could be anti-racist, we still do it, right? And you know, the sort of long history that we've that's happened to us being people who aren't the ruling elite has been that we have been divorced, kind of separated from all the ways of living and made dependent on the state and market. And so that is why we kind of have these logics so rooted in us, right? That like you do have to work in order to make money, in order to buy food, in order to survive and pay your rent, right? So like you look into the history of the kind of imposition of capitalism, it's tearing people away from all the ways that they were able to live. So I'm interested in thinking about how right now, even though that is the dominant structure, we are already finding ways to live and sort of thrive together that do not rely on those things. So another way of talking about what I'm like interested in is historically it's been called social revolution, right? Like you can't just have a kind of political revolution without a total overturning of the way that our society is organized, right? This is a lesson from like the gay liberation time, from women's liberation, that like you know, you can't just have a class-based revolution because you would still be you know, and then say like later we'll free the women, later we'll free the gays, right? Because that same class system creates those things. So we need a social revolution, of kind of total revolution. You know, other ways that this shows up too, and it's something that's very naturalized for us, is in our kind of understanding of family, right? Like who belongs with each other, to each other, who has power over each other, the kind of the dominance of adults over children, as like a kind of in the US right now, there's this whole right-wing movement of parental rights, which they're invoking to stop children from learning about the histories of racism and stop children from being able to transition, right, if they're trans. And it's like this proprietarian relationship of a parent over a child. And that's so naturalized in our lives that children are like our property, not full human beings. Move to a couple other things. So one of the ways that maybe I'll get into the kind of like different theories of that like sort of cutesy way of delineating the theories of anarchism that I'm proposing, and I want to leave them for talking about. But the idea is that we, I kind of take this from certain forms of Marxist feminism that talks about social reproduction, that like we are doing the work of reproducing the world, even if it's a world that keeps us under its thumb, which means that we're implicated in that work, right? And therefore, we're not just simply products of it, but that we can do things to recreate or to create a different world, right? We're not doomed to constantly recreate the world that we hate. And that's sort of like, I think, very powerful. And it's something that gets overlooked in a lot of leftists, and especially academic work that just tends to describe how things are and why they're so horrible. So like the sort of ways that I think about, or like that I use to kind of break down my ideas of anarchism are first this kind of breakup theory, what I called. The second chapter is sort of based on that. You know, like, I mean it in terms of like breaking up with the state, right? I take that from Connor Habib. He used that phrase. I thought that was good, but also just like the experience of ending relationships. It's a powerful experience that you know, like, first of all, we're like kind of taught to think that ending a relationship, especially one that is like supposedly like a romantic monogamous relationship, is a kind of failure. But anyone who has ended a relationship, even having gone through heartbreaking grief, usually the relationship ends and there's a reason and you're better off, right? Like divorce is good. Like anyone whose parents got divorced probably know that it was better for them once that happened, even though it was sad. Because living with parents who should be divorced is not awesome. And I'm not being flippant about it, right? Like breaking up involves grief, and like we have to face that grief. We have to think about what we're losing, right? It's not just saying like kick everything out and throw everyone away, because that isn't the theory that I would want to talk about. But sort of like giving up what we hold as like luxuries, giving up what we hold as precious, letting things not work, right? One way that I think about it is that when you're a child and you don't get to choose your surroundings and you have friends that are just the people around you, right? And then it turns out maybe when you're older that they weren't great friends. And then you get to choose other people and you're like, oh, those people were just there. They're just there. It's the same thing with your like blood family that you're forced to kind of live within. And maybe some people, queer people, like know the kind of suffocation of growing up in a family, not being able to be yourself. Another way of thinking about it is like, in this kind of breakup theory, is like just looking how we embody power in our relationships to people. There's a part of like getting used to letting others care for you, but also letting them off the hook for caring for you, right? And I think that's important. Care, I could talk a lot about care. I talk a lot about in the book. It's a word that's like overused, I think, and a lot of value is placed in it. But sometimes in a simple way, for me, like, I don't know, this came to me one time, like, just like the feeling of someone putting their hand on your chest, right? Like, that is like a kind of elemental form of care that doesn't necessarily need to be a commitment to doing anything beyond that. So breakup theory, creating boundaries, saying no to things, super powerful. We get like run our lives through FOMO, the fear of missing out, right? But like usually when you say no and don't go out wherever your friends are and you get to like stay at home, it's like pretty awesome to do that, right? And like missing a night out drinking is like not a loss. So these are tactics of refusal that we can then we practice them in our lives, but they're also important for like the kind of this like political structure that I'm talking about, refusing your role at work, right? Whatever that role is, it's not necessarily like be shit at your job until you get fired, but like don't snitch on people, right? Don't compete with other employees, like steal the resources and give them to people who need them. Don't do the good worker thing, right? You can fly under the radar there too, but refuse a role in gender, right? Don't embody like patriarchal masculinity, whether you're a man or a woman, right? Like we all sort of bear that, right? So find ways to kind of refuse your roles. Giving yourself permission, I think, is important, right? Giving yourself permission, like this kind of, this new piece I read talks a lot about imposter syndrome, right? Like the truth is that everyone is sort of like shows up in the situations and having no idea what they're doing, and usually we're just like there's some elemental form of trust that lets us kind of operate within that. So we can like embody not knowing and just like kind of doing our best. So breakup theory. My other theory, this is like the gay anarchist theory, is the cruising theory of anarchism. I take this, an inspiration for me, theoretically, is Samuel Delaney in his book Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, which is a book that the first half of it sort of describes his experience from the 60s through the 80s of sexual encounters in Times Square in New York in porn theaters between men, consensual, anonymous, casual encounters that also formed like really beautiful relationships that aren't on the model of like how we think relationships form. And in this book, the second half of the book is like a theory of it, right? He's thinking about the city and spaces of encounter. And the way that the city has progressively been designed is to create it or to make it impossible for us to have encounters across class lines, across race lines, to keep us within the boundaries. So he comes up with these two ideas: contact and networking. Networking, we all kind of know, right? It's the thing you're supposed to do to get a good job. That's like within the class system. Networking, we think that if we work really hard at networking, we're going to get a good job, but it's actually kind of like winning the lottery anyway, right? Contact is this coincidental thing that happens, like, one of his examples is in the supermarket line, right? Because it's like, well, now our supermarkets are often class-based, right? So thinking about a place where anyone kind of goes, public parks used to be a place where that happened, but now they have like the rich person's park in the park. But places where you can encounter anyone to start a conversation with people, like contact. There's something that happens in between us that we cannot predict. And for him, that's like a way to kind of refuse these roles, refuse the kind of like pathways that are put before us, and create new possibilities. So I think this is interesting to kind of like think about how we create spaces of contact. And one way of describing them are like low pressure spaces of interaction with people, versus the kind of high intensity commitment sort of spaces that we have, like often the way that we encounter people, right? Making plans. Now, like, because like everyone sort of like has social anxiety, and we have our language to talk about our neurodivergence. We talk a lot about like, the different ways that we don't make plans with people. They feel, or like just not even picking up the phone when someone calls, right? It feels like this commitment, right? So finding ways to create like low stakes connections, creating actual physical spaces for that, I think is important. So that's cruising theory, because cruising, if you don't know what I'm talking about with cruising, is like a sexual practice of like a public space where people go there because they want to have sex and don't really necessarily want strings attached, right? And it operates through consent, and there's a certain kind of agreement about how things go that allows for a kind of safety that we don't have in the kind of dating where you have to take someone home, right? If you want to sleep with them, right? When you take someone home, you're no longer in this kind of space that has its own kind of regulation. So yeah. And then my other theory, or way of talking about it, this isn't in the book, but it's something I'm thinking about now. It's a little bit in the book, I just don't call it this. And at risk of sounding, really bourgeois, is my Mrs. Dalloway theory. Is that, I love Virginia Woolf. So to me, this is like thinking about being a host and being a guest at the same time. And also in that I hear ghost too, because like, I don't know, I think about Mrs. Dalloway just sort of standing at the top of her stairs greeting everyone, right? So practicing hosting, practicing also being a guest in a relationship to others. The thing that Mrs. Dalloway does, like in this book, and something that I know anarchists are very good at, and maybe something that you have done and enjoy, is like bringing people together into a space and then letting them do their own thing, right? Like not regimenting it, but allowing for possibilities to happen. That is like a beautiful thing. I've organized lots of like conferences and anarchist book fairs, and there's this thing, like you think that you have to plan everything down to the final detail, but there's this magic that happens when you get the people there, and it just like it occurs, right? Like there is work doing to prepare that space that allows that to happen, right? This is also something I practice as a teacher. So yeah, but I think we have to think about guests and hosts as these kind of like things that we're doing both of them at all times. So like, like thinking also that like I come from the United States, which is a settler colony. So I'm like not, I do not, my relationship to that land is through it's being stolen from the indigenous people there. So I'm like, I guess I have to think about myself as a guest, not belonging or the property. But I think we could think about that, in terms of the relationship to the earth too, because property is one of the major relationships of power that organizes our world. I'm just doing a kind of quick thing. And for me, this is also connected from my sort of Jewish experience to thinking of diaspora, to like thinking about our movements around the world. A lot of the structures that we hold on to are places that contain us. And we think of that they're not porous, right? Like the city has, or the state has boundaries, but actually there's this like kind of movement, in our world, capital is allowed to move freely around the world because of the regiment of borders, right? And we want to do it differently, where people can move freely around the world, and not sort of the concentration of power. Yeah, so maybe this is a good time to end it and what I'm saying, and leave some room for discussion, because I'd love to hear anything you have to say or questions. I can put questions out, like I'd be interested, in things that you're doing that you feel like maybe have some of these elements that I've discussed, or things that you would like to do, projects that you're involved in here in Edinburgh or locally, or regionally, things that are working or not working, or like thoughts about how we trust each other, right? And how we make priorities about what we need to work on to try to get to a better world. I don't know, that's a lot of stuff. I'm just putting it out there if you need help, but I'm open to any kind of question or any thought that you'd like to share. You take a minute too to like collect your thoughts, because I've just been talking. I'll take a sip of something.
I'm not really formulated this, so it might not make sense, but I'm just interested in what you're saying about this identification, and then when you're talking about being a guest in like a settler, sorry, words are not coming to me, but
No worries.
and how that, I'm not arguing what you're saying. I think that makes sense, what you said about being a guest in America, etc. But how does the anarchist, that theory of disidentification, like consolidate with the idea of people having owned land before colonial settling, etc.? I'm just wondering, and as I say, I obviously agree with the having to identify those power imbalances and stuff, but I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on negotiate those two ideas, if they are separate ideas. As I said, not.
No, I think that I have different thoughts maybe, and hopefully like we get to what you're asking. So like, first of all, right, the United States isn't the only settler colony, right? There's like Canada, there's Israel, there's South Africa, there's New Zealand, Australia, and that's not all of them. But this is an important thing that we have to contend with, right? So like a lot of indigenous anarchists or indigenous organizers, they don't have to be anarchists, will sort of point out the shortcomings of anarchists and other kind of liberatory organizations in the States for like not including the idea of like a shorthand for land back, right? That like the indigenous people would be able to use the land, or like determine how the land gets used. I think it's very hard for Westerners, to hear land back without understanding land as property. And for a lot of indigenous theorists and scholars, will talk about land as doesn't mean the same thing, right? It's a relationship. Land is a relationship. It has temporality. It's a way of knowing and learning. It's a way of living. So that's for me, disidentification is like we do not even know how to live, right? Those of us who've been brought up in a Western world, we do not know how to live, which is another reason why we're stuck, right? Because like right now, could we reproduce our lives? I don't mean like the lives that we live, but could we like just survive? Most of us probably couldn't right now, right? We'd have to form the relationships that allow for that to happen. So that's like a form of disidentification too, like that we think that like the way to survive comes from like working in a particular way, and food coming from a particular place. So what that means in terms of actually organizing is like in kind of coalition or solidarity with indigenous groups in different places is kind of following their like sort of lead and learning from ways of knowing that you run a risk there of like co-optation and sort of cultural appropriation, which I think a lot of people do, and there's lots of histories of that. But yeah, that's like that's an important place. It's an important place to start thinking about it. Yeah, did that sort of get you?
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And I'm speaking not as an indigenous person, right? I'm speaking as a diaspora too. And I'm very interested in thinking about like the relationship between indigeneity and diaspora. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that just it piqued my interest as a Scottish person who doesn't get taught about indigenous cultures and stuff at all through education and within our it's not like a conversation we have here. It just those two things pique my interest in relation to each other.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you're not in the States taught that either, right? To the extent that you learn indigenous culture, it's something that's gone and passed. There's like people talk about the settler state as a structure, not an event. It's something that's ongoing that continues that erasure and a creation of pastness. And there's probably a version of that you could think about in like Scotland or like Ireland too, as places that were colonized by the English at some point, right? I'm not adept in that history personally. Yeah.
I'm thinking about rejection. I work in social policy, which is very much and I was thinking about in the aftermath of the global financial crisis in the UK, the coalition government opposed policies, and there was this rhetoric around the big society, all of this idea that communities would rise up to fill the gaps, basically. And that's what's happened. We have seen a proliferation of food banks. There's now a food bank in town that they pretty much.
Right.
And I guess I'm just wondering, like, I mean, the anti-poverty concept in the UK responds to that by saying, no, like, that's not the answer. We need such a and so I guess I'm just wondering, like, what, from your perspective, is the relationship between, like, is that not actually easy or it's a good thing, or is it sometimes legitimizing these?
Yeah, this is a super important question and something that like comes up in various ways. And it's something that we have to be very attentive to and wary of, right? It's a form of co-optation or recuperation of the work that we do. And the state maintains power by continually doing that. So COVID is another example where like we can see that we came together to fill the gaps where the state abandoned us, and then that was used as a sort of justification. Disaster, since there's like so much climate disaster, that's a place. So one way that people talk about this is like, it's not, okay, so we don't want to say like, well, we won't do anything, right? The like powerful way to do it is to make sure that your mutual aid projects, mutual aid is also an anarchist term, right? It's talking about like giving within a community without imposing hierarchies of like giver and receiver, rather than like charity models, which is one that reproduces the same hierarchies. So our mutual aid needs to be confrontational with the state, right? We have to find ways that it doesn't get absorbed or co-opted. And I think we get stuck a lot, you know, like a lot of the people I know who did mutual aid during COVID ended up frustrated because like, we're like, oh, we're really, it's just kind of charity, right? Or we're just passing around the same buck. I mean, this happens a lot in queer community too, right? You're just like passing the same money around for everyone's surgery or like whatever. You know, it's not confrontational. So we have to find ways for that to threaten the state, right? And capitalism. But I think the state is really important there. And there's examples of that. There's historical examples that I could like, you know, the one that everyone always goes to is the Black Panthers breakfast program, which like seemed innocuous, but it was by the U.S. state seen as more dangerous than them like walking around with guns doing cop watch. The fact that they were giving people free breakfast, but it was a political tool also, right? It was a place for engaging in politics. Like that, like we have to sort of make those spaces politicized somehow. Now that doesn't necessarily mean handing out leaflets or whatever and like lecturing to people about how they should believe. There has to be a way that like in the enacting of these things, we are seen to have power, right, in ourselves, that we're overturning this idea of like receiving aid, for example. The other thing that I think about, and this is, I mean, that's not a solution, I told you, it's just like a way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it, I think that's important is like, I get this from abolitionist thinking as like the non-reformist reform. So abolitionists, we want to abolish prisons, but there's people in prison right now, right? And we need to help them with whatever they need and listen to them for what they need. So how do we change prisons without making prisons more powerful? That's the idea of a non-reformist reform. So like you can propose things like policy measures that aren't going to strengthen the system itself, but get the people what they need. So we can think about that in terms of policy, like, you know, the easy way to think about it in prison is like, don't build more prisons, right? Never, the solution is never like a trans prison, because then you fill it with trans people, right? And we want to get trans people out of prison because prison is not safe for anyone. So another way I might think about it, and this is the way that I like kind of relate to my institutional role as someone who like has precarious employment in academic institutions, is like I have access to certain resources through my job. How can I use my access for things that like divert it from its purpose, right? So whether that's like getting someone to do a talk who's like a Black trans person who does abolition work and giving them money that they can use for that, or like, you know, like giving people AIDS or like whatever, like accrediting them so that they can do whatever they want with their lives, because I can just like manufacture that as within my role. So finding ways that whatever resources you have access to kind of countervene the hierarchies that you're supposed to be like enacting and imposing with them. You know, and like I think it's important to sort of know that there's certain things that aren't in themselves liberatory, even though you have a way to redistribute resources, like not to confuse yourself. Like I don't think being a professor is like radical, right? I think it's a job that I do, and then I try to do good things with it, but it's not like, I don't think that's the revolution, right? And so like with social work and stuff like that, it's a similar thing. Is that helpful way of thinking? Yeah.
You were asking about kind of projects that we might be locally. There are a couple that are kind of like putting on the contract specifically labeled as anarchist, that I feel do like it's like very much in line with a lot of things you talked about. And we in these acts at a lovely place called the Shrub Zero Waste Hub on Red Street. And we have bi-monthly a space
called Great Disabled Students, and it's basically a kind of social space for kind of disabled and neurodivergent girls and expressing people and allies to kind of and it's a space where I think really fits kind of what he was saying about kind of like low expectation spaces. So the art, especially, you know, when things are happening, like things that are commissioned before, like there's also lots of like organising that happens like in that space around protests. But you also, you know, play or change, or you know, it's also just where you go on a monthly basis to hang out with your friends, and we have like a quiet space corner for people who, you know, like want to be in this space, but also don't really have maybe like the social skills to like deal with actually interacting. And you know, there's you can bring your own craft with this, you know, my friend who is like the non-organized stuff, like has bags of crafts that she brings and can use, like again lots of like sharing of resources that happens. And Shrub is a kind of anarchist space in and of itself. They have it's their place where you can exist without being expected to spend money. It does have a cafe component, which means it's nice and lovely and comfortable, but you can crucially exist there without buying a drink, and you can even bring your own drink from home. Or, you know, you just hand it to you do it from us with this button, and it has a kind of little food kind of section at the back where like places like Pret and supermarkets give away, you know, really a lot of food that they can't sell because it's considered kind of more flashy. But and me personally, as someone who's like disabled and kind of working on like welfare decisions, like kind of like struggling to get to the end of the month, a lot of the time there have been times when, you know, me and my partner have fed ourselves because of the, you know, of the food available there, and because my friend who like I organise this with, she and her partner put together like one of the best community care bags with food and things for people who are struggling with living crisis. And we have another project called Warm Wednesdays in the same space, where and this used to be weekly. It's probably going to be kind of bi-monthly again soon, but again it's a space to combat the cost of living crisis, where you can come and have like some free soup, free hot drink, and share like tips for like staying warm, kind of like accessing help that you may not know that you're entitled to, that kind of thing. So those are things that I want to mention. I also wanted to make like semi-seriously there. I found myself wanted to take notes for myself. Speaking, realized I didn't have a notebook on me, so taking notes on a sketchbook.
Oh, yeah.
So I feel that this is like a very anarchic way of thinking.
Yeah, I love it. Well, sorry, I didn't mean to.
And I was done.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, thank you for sharing. That stuff sounds wonderful. And also, I just wanted to say that, like, I'm also coming from a disabled perspective and like learning through disabled like sort of wisdom about how you organize your life when you have disabilities, whatever they might be. That's just like both in terms of like acknowledging our interdependence, right, is a thing that we get from like disability justice, but also having boundaries that need to be created, or sorry, stated, not created, right, in terms of like spoon, like you said, with the spoon theory is like you have a limited amount of, you imagine like your capacity through however many, like a certain number of spoons, and that everything you do takes up a spoon. So at some point you don't have any spoons left to do things, right? And it's just a very easy way to talk about your lack of capacity, and then to be respected with that, which is very hard to do, especially in organizing spaces where you're expected to kind of like commit yourself to the revolution, till you die. So it's really wonderful to hear about that. Another thing that I just would pull out of what you said that I think is super important is that like, and I guess this kind of connects to imposter syndrome too in a way. I don't know, but like there are things that we can have access to and that we deserve to have, and often it's like specialized knowledge about how to get them, whether it's like how to do something or make something, or how to like turn the system to your favor or navigate it, because the bureaucracies are there to make it so that we don't get things right. And so sharing that knowledge, I think, is really important. So creating a space for that too. And then I guess one last thing, just I'm kind of reiterating what you said, but like creating those spaces where so many different things can happen. So like we may be organizing a march. We also play board games together, or we also like sit in silence with each other. Like that's so beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to try if anyone here is like interested in like coming to Evo Press, feel free to like come and speak to me.
Yeah, y'all should go to that place and do things there, and maybe bring some things too.
Yeah, I've been in there. It's a great little place, but I do feel that it's unusual in the trend over the last 10, 20 more years has been to lose spaces, and for it to become harder to find new ones. This last year, we lost the space down the road in Leith, the Autonomous Centre of Edinburgh. That's gone. It's proving very, very difficult to find a new place for the groups that were using it there. I mean, it was inadequate anyway. It was small and dilapidated. We wanted some bigger, some more welcoming, some more open. And just being able to do that, it's very hard. I think there's been like an overall trend of more enclosures, like public places become private and managed and policed. It requires more money to find any kind of space. Spaces that are available are often run by charities which use a business model, and again, if you're not doing something that they find acceptable, then you're not given that space.
Right.
I mean, I feel very pessimistic in a lot of time in how much things are shrinking rather than opening up.
Yeah.
There's like conformity about what people are allowed to do.
Yeah, I share for sure that a lot of that pessimism, and it feels like impossible. I mean, there's ways, like you're right in all the ways. So like space is getting harder and harder to get. The places that we've relied on to create those spaces are disappearing. There are places that exist and new places that pop up, and sometimes they find ways to hold on to it. Like in the town that I used to live, Asheville, there's been an anarchist bookstore for a long time in various iterations, and they just bought a building and they're going to make it into a community land trust so that it could survive whatever iteration it is now in the hands of the community. I don't know how easy that is to do something like that. I mean, there is like, like you're saying, charities, like, I mean, people have used, I gave one talk where someone was trying to talk about, I don't have a lot of first-hand knowledge about this, but like Alcoholics Anonymous as a kind of like anarchistic model. But I'm thinking about how they use like basements in churches or whatever, right? And like maybe, I don't know, I've done organizing that uses like Unitarian churches because they tend to be okay with certain things you do, and they have the real estate, right? Or colleges and universities, sometimes you can, it doesn't necessarily need to be something that's always there with the real estate. And then maybe we have to think also about like our homes. That's harder sometimes with needs of like space and privacy. But I mean, again, these aren't answers, and it's fucked. But yeah, people are doing things, and I don't know. I mean, I guess I continue the way that I continue my hope. And this, I guess, is what I hope the book does in some ways, like for the people who haven't thought about this before, because I want this book also to be accessible to people who thought a lot about this, but like I hoped when the pandemic hit that like the contradictions of our lives would be so clear that everyone would just refuse to like pay rent and go to work, right? In the ways that we've been doing it before. And that didn't happen. What we did get was the George Floyd uprising in the US, which spread internationally. And there's been more and more of these kinds of things happening. And so what I sort of been putting my energy into is like creating spaces for people to, realize that those contradictions are things that we do not have to put up with, and then find and innovate ways to continue to refuse and open up the spaces for us to like say something else.
Great. Thank you so much, Scott. I'm sure I could listen and like have this conversation for another couple of hours, but I'm afraid we have to end the event there, but I hope the conversations will continue. Let's give you another hand of applause for the great talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. This looks so cool. This is another good space that does stuff, and I'll hang around if anyone wants to come up and talk to me individually.